Welcome to the second event in the fall semester 2021 virtual series, Assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative, hosted by the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. The Pardee School's mission is to promote and communicate interdisciplinary research on globally important long-term issues that affect the human condition. The BRI is one of those issues. I'm Grant Rode of the Center for the Study of Asia, here to introduce our topic and speakers today. Our topic, focusing on the Maritime Silk Road, is economic and security aspects of China's global port development. We are fortunate to have with us two scholars who have been working together on this topic. Dr. Wendy Leutert is assistant professor in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University and is chair of the program in Chinese economics and trade. As a specialist in Chinese political economy, she will address party-state ties to port operating firms. Dr. Kardon is assistant professor in the U.S. Naval War College's Department of Strategic and Operational Research and managing editor of the China Maritime Studies Institute Red Book series on Chinese maritime power. His recent long article publications on the ports of Djibouti and Gwadar examined the concept of these ports as strategic strongpoints for China. Following the presentations, we will open the session to a question and answer period for the remainder of our 60 minutes. To ask a question, hit the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please type in your name and affiliation, and then your question. It will be easier for me as moderator to keep track of the questions if you ask your questions in the Q&A tab rather than in the chat tab. Drs. Leutert and Kardon, welcome, and thank you for joining us to share your recent work by talking to us about both the economics and security dimensions of China's global port development along the Maritime Silk Road. I'm pleased to turn the mic over to you, Professor Leutert, to begin looking at today's topic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rode, for that generous introduction. I'll go ahead and share the screen here. All right, can everyone see that now? Can't believe I'm still having technical issues after. Let's see. All right, how is this? Is this share okay?
Looks okay to me, very good.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Wendy Leutert, and I'm assistant professor at Indiana University. On behalf of Isaac and I'd like to first thank the organizers at Boston University for inviting us to participate in this event series, Assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative, and to everyone here for taking the time to attend the talk. So today I'll be presenting our joint research about the economic and strategic aspects of China's Maritime Silk Road. So I'll speak first and followed by Isaac. We very much welcome your questions and comments at the conclusion of our presentation. All right. So in August 2019, the People's Liberation Army Navy destroyer Xi'an entered Egypt's main port of Alexandria for a 4-day technical stop. The port arrived at a terminal that was operated and over 80% owned by two Chinese firms, the Hong Kong-based private company Hutchinson Ports and the state-owned Shenzhen Yantai Port Group. And the Chinese sailors on the vessel received a warm welcome at the port from China's ambassador to Egypt, a group of Chinese citizens, and the Egyptian Navy commander of the nearby Alexandria Naval Base. The ship then underwent specialized repairs at the large dry dock at the terminal, loaded up on supplies and equipment, and replenished its fuel and other goods. Now, on the surface, this visit by the Xi'an in Alexandria was a completely unremarkable event. It was a routine port call for a Chinese Navy that operates regularly across the Eastern Mediterranean and Northern Indian Ocean region. But if we look closer, we can consider this visit as an example of the growing scope and sophistication of Chinese military operations abroad, achieved without a network of overseas bases and allies. So like other blue water navies, the People's Liberation Army Navy supports its overseas operations using foreign commercial ports, but unlike other navies, it enjoys extensive access to dual-use facilities that are owned and or operated by Chinese companies. And so this motivates the two research questions for our study. First, what is the current status of China's global port expansion? And second, what are its international security implications? And by the end of today's talk, we hope to convince you that China's ability to leverage PRC firms' transnational commercial port network, most evident in the People's Liberation Army Navy's use of commercial ports for military logistics and intelligence functions, constitutes a novel form of state power projection. Now, when we think about assessing a state's ability to project power beyond its own borders, one key indicator that we think of is the possession of offensive military capabilities, and most commonly overseas bases. By this measure, it is clear that countries like the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, France, and numerous others have varying ability to project power abroad. In contrast, our research suggests that such base counting is very likely to lead us off base if we're assessing China's state power projection capabilities. And so in this work, together with Isaac, we argue that another way in which states can project power abroad is through so-called portfolio power projection. Please excuse our bad puns here with portfolio power projection. We have a lot of very bad maritime puns in the paper that is accompanying this work. So we argue that states can also project power abroad through portfolio power projection by directing, mobilizing, reorienting, and or repurposing their firm's international assets for strategic purposes. So in the case of China specifically, we find that China can project power through its highly distributed, yet also central position in a global portfolio of international port assets owned and or operated by Chinese companies. And so happy to talk later in either the Q&A or in the presentation in more detail, about specifically what we mean by having a highly distributed yet also central position in this global maritime network. So there's several factors that affect a state's ability to reliably project power overseas using overseas port assets. So first and most obviously from a basic material standpoint, a state must actually have companies that also themselves have a transnational network of complementary assets. And in addition, these companies must be able to maintain and exercise operational control over these assets. So this doesn't necessarily require having a sole ownership or majority ownership of a particular terminal asset or even an entire port, but a substantial equity position is typically associated with greater operational control. So in addition, these material assets must have some kind of dual use capabilities, and Isaac's going to talk in more detail specifically what types of port facilities support military use. So second, a state must be able to exercise significant influence over its firm's overseas operations and assets for material power, for power projection to occur. So first we have to have the material, the basic material prerequisite of having the firms and their overseas assets, but our argument also assumes that there is some degree of state control that is able to be exercised reliably and consistently over the firms and their transnational portfolios. So this is really a question of political possibility that is rooted in legal and organizational factors that are found in both the home and the host countries. So in our talk today, we're mostly focusing on the home country as well as the host country. We certainly think that the host country factors are important as well. We won't be talking about them much today, but we're happy to take questions about them in the Q&A. And there's a number of other scholars who are working on these types of questions, how domestic politics affect the BRI in different countries around the world. So how these overseas port assets are used, it does depend in part on these host country factors as well, terms like leases, concessions, contracts, and also how willing and able host countries are to enforce those contracts. So third and finally, we argue that potential power projection through these overseas portfolio assets also depends on geostrategic conditions. So how a given state perceives its own interests and threats to them is going to shape whether and to what extent they attempt to weaponize their positions in overseas ports. So some states like the United Arab Emirates or Singapore, they might actually meet some of these conditions or have these factors that I've just described, but they're unlikely to have the pursuit of military objectives as their goal, even if they do have companies that also, like China, have such a transnational network of commercial port assets. So let me speak a little bit more about mechanisms of state influence on firms. And so again, I've told you that we have this basic material prerequisite of first a state having firms that then themselves have these material international port assets abroad. That's kind of the material condition. And then we have the second order claim, the prerequisite that the state has to be able to exercise influence over firms' overseas operations and their assets. And so in our work and related writing that Isaac and I are doing, we divide these mechanisms of state influence into two broad types, organizational and legal. And so let's take a closer look at what these organizational and legal mechanisms of state influence on firms are. And here I'll start to speak more specifically about China. So the first and a very obvious form of state control over a company, over its operations and its assets is state ownership. And so in this case, the state might own part or all of the company. And for China specifically, this is a really important organizational mechanism of control for the overseas ports. And this is because the ownership and or operation of these overseas port terminals is highly concentrated in the hands of the so-called big three. And so that is COSCO Shipping Group, CM Port, and Hutchinson Ports. And so 2 out of the 3 of these are owned by China's central government. So they're central state-owned enterprises, or as you might hear us refer to them in the talk today, SOEs for short. And so specifically, these companies are COSCO Shipping Group, whose parent company COSCO is the central SOE, as well as CM Port, whose parent company China Merchants Group is a Hong Kong-based central SOE. So a lot of material on this slide, so just bear with me. I'm going to go through these organizational mechanisms of state control briefly. So another organizational mechanism of state control is executive appointment authority. And so here the logic is pretty simple. If you control the leader, then you control the firm. And for the largest and most strategically important central SOEs, including COSCO and China Merchants Group, again, the parent companies of these 2 shipping companies, their top executives are Chinese officials who are appointed by the Chinese Communist Party's powerful personnel organ, the Central Organization Department, together with higher level party authorities. So how does this appointment system work as a mechanism of state control? Well, in theory, having this cadre management system or this executive appointment authority, it works as a way of state control by aligning executive interests with the priorities and goals of the Communist Party. So having joint and concurrent appointments further facilitates the state's influence over firms. First of all, as many of you may already know, in almost all of the companies that are owned by China's central government, the chairman of the board also serves at the same time as the party secretary. So it's one person who is in both of those roles. And having these joint appointments, it really dissolves the division of labor and the implicit separation between commercial and political affairs. And so we argue that this can be seen as a way to restrict managerial independence by bringing executives more closely into the political realm of the party state. And concurrent appointments happen when a company executive also has positions in external political bodies. So for example, the chairman of Hutchinson, Victor Li, is also a member of the standing committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. And finally, party committees at all levels of state-owned enterprises, from the very top level of the parent company, all the way down through subsidiaries at different levels within the larger state-owned enterprise group. These party committees are also shaping company behavior through their authority to exercise the ability to discuss and decide so-called major decisions, which, as we can see from past precedent in some party documents, specifically include things like important operational matters or issues involving national security before they go to boards of directors for final determination. So shifting now to talk about the legal mechanisms, legally, the Chinese government has enacted defense, mobilization, and transportation laws that give it a clear legal basis to be using the corporate assets of these state-owned companies, not only within China, but also abroad. So the 2010 National Defense Mobilization Law, for example, establishes a system for the state to appropriate or take civilian assets and direct them toward military purposes. It clearly expresses the goal of integrating civilian and military functions and assets for long-term preparation and orderly efficiency, and mobilizing for national defense, and all of this under the unified leadership of the Communist Party. And so it talks specifically about maintaining and transferring strategic material reserves from companies to the military, or also permitting the state to give companies the tasks of storing, maintaining, or distributing military supplies at overseas facilities. So in addition, the later 2017 National Defense Transportation Law, it defines military and state authority over the use of civilian assets for national defense, including overseas assets like those international ports that we examine. And so this law specifically states that Chinese enterprises that are engaged in international transportation business are required to provide to support the ships, aircraft, vehicles, and the personnel of China's military operations. And it further states that the Chinese military, if needed in the event of crisis or contingency, it can station military representatives in relevant transportation companies. And so, we're reading a lot into these particular laws and what we're able to identify there, but we're also complementing our analysis by looking at discussion of these laws and related writing by PLA military analysts. And so our analysis of these two laws, together with other regulations and industry measures, suggests that there is a clear legal basis for state influence over firm operations and assets abroad. So this is all a bit of background. Let's move now into talking about the specifics of our analysis and our data. So empirical strategy for this research, we started out simply with data collection exercise to answer that first question, what is the current status of China's global portfolio? We first went out and tried to collect data and map every ocean port outside of China in which a Chinese firm operates or owns one or more terminal. And through this analysis, and we continue to update it, we've identified 94 ports in 50 countries. And next, we analyzed the actual and desired uses. Again, we're reading this intentionality through statements about the ports and how they could potentially be used, relying heavily again on those writings of the PLA analysts. As well as the limitations, we also look at of Chinese companies' global port network. And so I think we're making a pretty bold argument here, but we're also aware of some of the limitations of the potential non-commercial use of these facilities, whether it's in peacetime or in wartime. And so we do all of this analysis, mapping out the different ports, China's global port network, as well as considering some of the actual and desired uses and the international security implications of this global port network using an extensive original data set of hand-coded data drawing from multiple sources. And so our data includes industry sources. Fortunately, we were lucky to have a decent budget for this work, and so we're able to access some of these commercial sources like IHS Markit, Drury, Lloyd's List. We also looked at company annual reports and disclosures to security exchanges by these Chinese firms, their publicly listed subsidiaries. And we also looked at the database on Chinese military diplomacy that was collected by the US National Defense University. We looked extensively at Chinese language, military, industry, and academic writing. We looked as well at international reporting in the media, international media reporting, as well as Chinese media reporting. And then Isaac also had conducted some interviews with industry executives and analysts between 2018 and 2021. And so we're drawing on some of those conversations as well to inform our analysis. So let me end here and turn the slides over to Isaac to talk about some of the empirical findings of our data work and discuss more the international security implications. Over to you, Isaac. Thank you.
Okay, Isaac, here, go ahead.
Are you seeing my slide here? Great. Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Rode, and thank you, Wendy, for teeing this up really well. I have the easy part of this presentation, which is just giving you a quick sample of the empirics that we've been able to put together through a variety of open sources, and Wendy already told you a bit about where those came from. And I think, you know, a project like this is very heavily geographic, so we're using mapping in both its literal as well as its figurative sense. I think it's really important to conceptualize how this network lays down on the map, looking at it regionally, looking at it by ocean, and looking at it in particular in terms of major maritime choke points. And so I'm going to get into how exactly Chinese firms have distributed their ownership and operations by showing you a couple maps, if it allows me to click through. Let's see. Bear with me here. Okay, so as of today, and in fact, just updated it about a week ago to 94 after Costco took a minority stake in a port in Germany. There are 94 ports overseas that a Chinese firm either has an ownership or an operational stake in. It's worth noting here that we are not talking about the much larger number, perhaps on the order of thousands, of ports in which a Chinese firm has had some hand in construction or engineering. Those engineering and procurement and construction contracts tend to just sort of be one-off. You'll dredge a harbor, install cranes, etc. This is not trivial by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a separate question. These are not assets that end up being owned and operated by Chinese firms. And so that's ultimately what we're looking at. And I'm gonna click through if I can here and show you the distribution of various Chinese port projects by firm. This latter one, the purple one that just came up of China Merchants Port, are a joint venture with a French firm in which there is no operational management role for the Chinese actor. It's Terminal Link is majority owned by CMA CGM, and they do all the operations, including, as you'll note, at U.S. ports in Miami and Houston. So there is a definite distinction between ownership and operation, or just ownership. And ultimately, it's those that have an operational role for a Chinese firm, I think, that are most significant from a strategic standpoint. And then finally, there are a whole handful of other PRC firms that have operational or ownership stakes around the world, and hopefully you can see these clearly enough. You should be able to zoom in on your screen and poke around. And in Q&A, happy to talk. I'd say pretty much about every one of these. We spent a lot of time poking around in our data and have quite an extensive array of information about each and every one of these, some more rich information than others. And just looking at the map, a few things jump out that are worth noting. One is this is highly distributed. Just to say, there are Chinese owned and operated ports on every continent, on every kind of oceanic coastline of every continent, excepting Antarctica. And they are roughly evenly distributed in a continental sense. There's actually quite a lot, across North and South America, in Europe and Africa, in Southeast and South Asia, and in the Middle East. But what makes this a distributed and central network, and I don't think I have in these slides the very dense cluster of Chinese ports on the Chinese mainland, is that these are all linked up, as you can see through the main shipping lanes that we have sketched in here in light black lines. These are linked up to Chinese ports, and essentially firms run shipping lines between particular ports and have certain guaranteed cargoes and routes. And because Chinese ports on the mainland constitute such a huge portion of maritime trade and transport, 7 of the top 10 ports in the world are in coastal China. If you look at it in throughput terms, it can be even greater. But as the world's factory, as it were, over the course of reform and opening, and as a highly trade-oriented economy, China has essentially taken this central position from a market standpoint, and that manifests geographically as a highly distributed and we would say redundant as well network. None of the individual ports themselves is necessary to the achievement of the types of power projection that we're talking about. It's rather the overall networked effect. So what we can say about this distribution, and it's something that comes through only when you spend some time reading what Chinese analysts, and particularly folks in the PLA writing for places like our Naval War College, their equivalent, writing for officers to understand doctrine and understand strategy, is that there is what they call a maritime lifeline. And this is crudely represented in these arrows that I've superimposed on our map as the sea line of communication stretching from coastal China, where all those major ports are and all the major Chinese markets and population centers, across to vital resource inputs and market outputs, as you might think of it. That is to say, China imports something like half of its oil from the Persian Gulf, also a lot from Africa, and that certainly is a major area of commercial and strategic importance that folks both on the commercial as well as the military side think about quite a lot, and that's that northern fork of this sea line of communication. And then also not to be neglected is the southern or western fork, which both are stretching across the Indian Ocean, but heading up through the Bab el-Mandeb, passing by China's only actual dedicated military base at Djibouti. There you can see a green dot at that particular maritime choke point, and heading up into the Mediterranean, where the European markets are in fact China's main export target. And so the ports are naturally clustered around those areas where China is moving large volumes of commodity resources as well as containerized manufactured products. There's a back and forth process, and it is highly concentrated along this lane. We've got, let's see if I can pull the number exactly. Yeah, it's there on your slide. 45 of the 94 overseas ports are on this lifeline, and an increasing concentration of them over recent years since 2015. So we tend to think of this as the one real empirical kind of outstanding empirical fact that we get out of looking at this in a geographic sense. And there's plenty more to say on how the commercial and strategic objectives are essentially integrated and unified. But I think a short way of addressing this is to say the often posed question is, are Chinese ports or any other form of Chinese infrastructure, are these pursued for commercial reasons, or are they pursued for strategic reasons? And to me, the answer is yes. You can't disentangle these motivations. The way the PLA thinks and writes about it is that commerce, and particularly access to vital resources, is fundamental to the overall well-being and health and survival of the party and to the Chinese state. And therefore, its military protection and security for it, protecting overseas interests, is the way it's been encoded doctrinally, is a fundamental mission. So moving on, and Wendy spoke at length about the implications of different types of ownership, and it's just worth noting descriptively that there's a very large proportion, well over half of these projects that have a central state-owned enterprise as one of the owners of the terminal or multiple terminals at a port. It also bears noting that a large proportion of the smaller players, whether local state-owned enterprises and even private firms, have a central SOE stake in them. For example, the Shanghai International Port Group, which you may have seen just took over operations at the Haifa port in Israel, is a local state-owned enterprise based out of Shanghai. So there's a Shanghai governmental role in it, but it's 15% owned by COSCO, the central SOE. And so, there are a lot of ways to think about that, but one that we think is really important is that, the network quality of ports and shipping is such that you gain some scale advantages from having the ability to manage and operate and control a larger network that's more widely distributed. So the more centralized that is within, say, COSCO management, the easier it is for Beijing, which has a direct line to COSCO, as it were, to understand what's flowing in and out of them, to understand the facilities and potentially utilize it. And that's ultimately where we've gotten by looking at this empirically. We really approached the problem, or rather the subject matter, with an open mind, and tried to do this inductively. Built up this very heavy database that I continue to maintain in Excel despite Wendy's protestations. And it shows us that the PLA Navy has, in fact, been extensively utilizing these Chinese firm-owned and operated ports, increasingly over time and with greater sophistication over time. So at this date, over a third of the ports with a PRC firm owner and operator have hosted a PLA Navy vessel. We're here looking at, in the image at the right, of a visit to Khalifa Port in the United Arab Emirates, which is a particularly interesting project. It was 90% owned by COSCO. COSCO sold off part of that stake to another Chinese firm, but in effect, it is a Chinese firm controlled project. It is the largest and most modern container port facility in the Middle East, and there's a natural commercial incentive that's driving COSCO there. But as you can see, and it's a little bit cut off, but we see that the captain of the PLA Navy ship that showed up there in 2018, I believe, flanking him is the Chinese ambassador, and all along the pathway there are adoring overseas Chinese, presumably people working on Chinese projects there, maybe some permanent residents in the UAE, welcoming them in. And you can see in the top right the COSCO shipping quay crane there. The PLA Navy talks a lot about, in its own writings, about what it can do to solve its problem of protecting Chinese overseas interests without having access to an overseas base, or prior to 2017 without any, and since 2017 with only one, which is really insufficient for most purposes. And what we're seeing is a growing operational repertoire of PLA Navy showing up, doing obviously diplomatic things, as you see here, but also, as noted in the second bullet, since 2017, we've seen at least 9 technical stops, which is to say doing somewhat more sophisticated work on a ship beyond just taking on fuel and food and water, and giving the sailors a bit of time to stretch their legs. And that is all part and parcel of being able to operate a global navy, or a blue water navy. And we have typically thought about this as something that can only happen if you have this extensive network of bases. And I think that is in large part a function of mirror imaging what the American Navy has done and what the British Navy did before it. And I think we need to look very carefully at differences in the way that the PRC has approached this. So in addition to that logistical function, which is easily observed in open source reporting, and I think we don't know everything that goes on in a port call, but the fact that they report sometimes on a technical stop, I think is notable. We can pretty reliably make inferences based on what PLA analysts write, as well as just basic knowledge of what is going on operationally at pier side at any commercial port, to say that intelligence uses for these facilities are probably pretty significant, just from a commercial standpoint. And we certainly know that commercial intelligence is something that the Chinese state has had a hand in and caused some controversy, certainly with the United States and Europe. The comings and goings of ships and their crews and their cargoes and their fuel requirements and their various other information that's essentially bundled in with any commercial port call. It is in itself quite interesting. But of course, U.S. Navy and its partner navies also operate all around the world and often make port calls at commercial facilities, some of which have a Chinese firm operating and owning one or more terminals there. And there's a sort of more acute and more interesting set of intelligence collection goals that might be met there that we can speculate on, ultimately are not spoken of in any Chinese open sources, of course. But these are non-trivial capabilities. But it's worth pointing out that the logistics and intelligence functions, which we think of as the principal military uses of these ports, seem likely to be pretty limited to peacetime use. And in a way that may be their purpose. It's very difficult to envision scenarios in which a commercial port owned and operated, even if it's a facility that is 100% owned or majority owned by a Chinese firm, that it would be available to the PLA Navy in the event of active hostilities for wartime use. And this ends up being purely hypothetical. We don't have any cases of it. The nearest that we have to high intensity operations are a handful of non-combatant evacuations beginning in Libya in 2011, when the PLA Navy didn't have any vessels that it was able to deploy on site and needed to figure out how to get merchant vessels to evacuate a large population. And then subsequently in Yemen in 2015, when there was a small PLA Navy presence, but mostly was conducted by an airlift. But those cases are illustrative of this issue of the actual use for any higher end purpose than peacetime logistics and this kind of steady state intelligence collection is an open question. And there is some concern in Chinese writing that we've been able to detect that, this is not a network that's really sufficient to solve any major sort of combat type problem. But from a strategic standpoint, what it provides is a level of security for the flows of vital resources, for the essential security of the Chinese economic system, and a potential coercive lever against other states that might threaten that. So that there's this sort of offense-defense spiral paradox that students of international relations will be familiar with, is that even if the motivations are largely defensive for deploying the PLA Navy and using these assets, ultimately they manifest as an offensive capability. You see some of the world's most capable ships operating in sensitive regions, and it makes other states insecure. And you see this essentially tragic cycle. We're running short on time, so I'll just be very brief and say that we've spent a bunch of time also thinking about the real nuts and bolts of what it takes to use a commercial facility for military purposes. And I've spent a lot of time talking to Navy logisticians and supply officers and surface warfare officers. Happy to discuss this at length, but there are a variety of technical characteristics of ports that make them more or less useful. And I guess the one thing to say on this is that not every port needs to have every major characteristic and be able to support every single vessel in the PLA Navy. What you need is a network that can support the operation of the fleet in the area, and that may well be distributed across several different ports. That task becomes much, much easier if those port terminals are managed and operated by, say, a COSCO or a China Merchants Port that has a great deal of muscle memory and institutional capacity to coordinate operations across multiple facilities, move the right supplies to the right place, right people to the right place, knowing where you can get what you need. So that is sort of shades into some of these obstacles, and I've noted them with respect to wartime use. But even for peacetime use, the terms of leases and concessions that Chinese firms have varies by state to state. And ultimately, that's why the case study approach we think of as a really valuable complement to this kind of top-down view. It will vary based on the jurisdiction, based on the particular arrangements in the lease, how much control operationally a Chinese firm will have it, have over a facility. And certainly there is also the risk, as the United States has experienced in the past, as the United Arab Emirates experienced in a tussle with China over a Djibouti facility, that a state may just decide to nationalize your asset. And then certainly commercial ports pose a variety of technical challenges, don't necessarily support what the Navy or any Navy needs. But just by way of recapping, we can say that Chinese companies now operate a very extensive network that covers every major region and waterway worldwide. They're particularly clustered around this major sea line of communication stretching from eastern China into the Persian Gulf and into the Mediterranean. And that these assets are subject to varying degrees of Pardee state influence. It's not the case that it's monolithic, and we have this variation mapped out in quite exquisite detail, and are happy to discuss the characteristics of individual ports. And we are working on conceptualizing this and thinking about this as a mode of state power projection that we don't quite have a handle on, and that certainly doesn't fit the normal categories that we are accustomed to thinking about in international relations. So finally, a couple implications. Given that there are these dual use capabilities that have been demonstrated from a large number of these ports, this looks sort of like a next best solution for China in allowing its Navy to, quote, protect overseas interests over in a global scope, but without the geopolitically costly and perhaps politically impossible in some ways task of building a large network of military bases. This is not to say that they will not try and may not succeed in establishing some more dedicated bases, but it seems altogether unlikely that it's going to be something like the US network or the former British network. The conditions geopolitically don't support it. It doesn't need to be overtly, quote, weaponized, as one line of scholarship has proposed for a variety of interdependent economic networks, for it to be a coercive instrument in great power competition. The United States does not have anything approaching China's position in the maritime trade and transport sector. You're thinking across not just ports, but also shipping, shipbuilding, et cetera. And there are ways that, you know, in tailored fashion or in crude fashion, that you can envision this market position, this central position in distributed network, as offering some ways to disrupt vital supply chains and make it difficult for other navies or other economies, frankly, to operate smoothly. And finally, we are thinking about ways that this concept can be applied across other sectors, but certainly have given most thought to this port network. So I've gone a little over, I apologize, but we are keen to hear from Dr. Rode in our audience, and happy to engage folks who have particular interest in this problem set offline. So thank you. I will stop my share. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Wendy and Isaac, for that really tour de force look at 94 ports that have direct Chinese involvement in terms of investment or with management of the ports, with implications for port contracts and many other ports throughout the world. And the idea of how much different this is from the way that the U.S. presents itself in the maritime arena is really has been a profound takeaway from this presentation. I'm going to encourage people to think about these remarks and to type your questions into the Q&A tab. But while that is happening, I would like to perhaps suggest that we look at an area that is of increasing interest to me right now, which is Europe. And that you said that you were prepared to talk about all 94 of these ports. So I might mention 2 or 3 of them and get your responses about that. And you know, my sense is that you know, Piraeus, of course, has become extremely important in southeastern Europe, and yeah, I've been there a number of times since 2009, when the Chinese began to get involved and watch that enormous growth there, which seems to have increasingly positive feelings on the part of Greeks on the ground, because the economy is getting better, and They were really in the doldrums prior to that. But they're much more active throughout the Mediterranean, the Chinese and the ports that I actually have found at least 20 ports where they have involvement around the Mediterranean. That in looking at the trade, the big struggle in Europe to me seems to be between the northern ports, the German ports, the Dutch ports, which are the largest ports now by volume, but Piraeus is now moving up. It's probably the largest port in the Mediterranean right now, but Valencia, of course, is also huge. So you have this struggle between northern and southern Europe in terms of really the market being the Central and Eastern European countries. And does Rotterdam want to lose that trade to Piraeus? And so China is involved in both. So the small ports of how China is going to get from Piraeus up into Hungary and beyond into the 17+1 countries, Central and Eastern European countries. So one port, if you have any observations about smaller ports in the Adriatic, I've noticed Rijeka is a small port in Croatia that seems to be a link that may be able to almost bypass this major railroad development between Serbia and Hungary, the Belgrade-Budapest railway, which is under construction now in Serbia, but is going much slower in the EU-controlled Hungary in terms of the way it goes. So anyway, Rijeka is one of those things, a small port, but I've also been to Bar in Montenegro, which may be in the opaque agreement for developing the roads in Montenegro as part of the BRI. It may be the collateral for that road ultimately, and the use of ports, Mombasa as collateral in these international negotiations. And then the port in Northern Europe that if you wanted to comment on, aside from the larger ports, maybe Zeebrugge in the Netherlands, where from the news reports that I've seen, that where the Chinese really got a black eye in Piraeus for the labor relations initially and the strikes against the Chinese involvement, which has softened over time. But it seems to me that they immediately learned from that scenario and have a much more positive labor relations program in Zeebrugge right now. So this also gets into this question of the commercial versus the military and strategic applications. I mean, Zeebrugge, I'd say, is strictly commercial, but what are the real strong point strategic implications for Piraeus, for instance? So anyway, this is more broadly, taking a look at one region in a little more detail and some comments. So thank you very much for thinking about this. Okay.
Thanks. Wendy, do you want me to take a first crack at this?
Yeah, I think, overall, we've been looking at the emergent properties of the network, but we have also looked at trying to categorize different types of ports, including these smaller ports, and based on whether or not they possess some of the facilities that Isaac had spoken about. And so we try to categorize in the context of our argument, whether they would be low, medium, or high in terms of their capability for dual use for the PLA Navy. So we are looking at some of the individual ports as well, in addition to studying this overall network. But I'll let Isaac speak specifically about some of the ports that you mentioned. Thank you for these comments.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rood, for a couple of interesting leads, actually. So of those ports in the Adriatic, the South Central European ports, none of those currently has a Chinese firm operating or owning a terminal. I suspect Czech or other Chinese firms may have been involved in some construction there, and I'm sure they're extensive in developing relations in trade and perhaps other infrastructure. So I've got a whole parallel list in my database of ports to watch, and a couple of those are now on that list. But on Piraeus, I guess it's worth noting that Piraeus really stands out for a couple of reasons. One, as you noted, it has been commercially successful. It really was turned around by COSCO and is now, I think it's between Piraeus and Valencia, as you said, for the largest container throughput in the Med. So this is a big business. The other really notable feature about that facility is that it's the only one that we're aware of, and I'm pretty confident it is in fact the only one in which a Chinese firm has a stake, not just in an operating lease in one or more terminals, but in the port operator itself. And different countries and different ports have different arrangements, different public-private combinations of ways that ports are managed, but ultimately the port authority, I said port operator, but the Piraeus Port Authority, just recently, the Costco was able to claim its upgrade to a 67% stake. They had still a controlling 51% stake. So in addition to having 100% ownership of 2 terminals and a third being built, they're also in this really important position of making decisions about the overall development and operations at the whole port facility. And for students of Greek history, you'll recall that the Athenians also thought, the city-state of Athens thought of Piraeus as the fundamental way of sustaining their sea power among the Greek city-states, and it's a highly strategic location in terms of access to Europe and access to the Mediterranean overall. On that north-south question, I think that the nature of countries like the Netherlands and now Germany, where Costco's got a stake at Hamburg, and the UK, where Hutchison is a huge player, is such that these are very, very large, highly kind of saturated, internationally saturated facilities. Rotterdam's a good example, where there are 3 Chinese firms that operate 3 different terminals there, and maybe have stakes in a 4th. I have to double check, but those are only a handful out of the several dozen terminals that are operating there. Netherlands has a very robust rule of law system and a very sort of organized way of managing these concessions. And so there's not, from my perspective, there's not much, if any, type of military use likely at a facility like that. Although there have been friendly port calls to show the flag, and there's not much leverage that a Chinese firm or the Chinese government, sort of through the instrument of a firm, would be able to place on that port in order to change its operations in some way. These are pretty pure commercial plays, but ultimately in aggregate, if Chinese firms have a dominant market position in Northern Europe, which they do not now, there are a number of big firms that are indigenous to Northern Europe that are really huge players there. AP Moller Maersk stands out as an example. But over time, the trend is that Chinese firms are sort of the lead bidders on every tender that opens up. Hamburg is a good example. We see a couple more opening up, and I think this is sort of a long-term process of China is going to have a lot more operational control over the flow of goods and ultimately trade and the economic well-being of these countries. And whether or not they choose to use that as a coercive instrument, I think is actually not that controversial now. We've seen it happen with Australia. We've seen it happen more with the Philippines, with Japan in varying ways. And we certainly see different ways of exercising that leverage with some of the smaller European states. So plenty more to say on that, Grant. I'd love to talk offline, but I don't want to drown out the rest of our time.
Right, and my apologies for asking a question with many dimensions. I'd like to go on and perhaps just quickly read 4 questions, 2 of which are from presenters in this particular series. Deborah Browdegum, maybe this will be for Wendy, regarding intelligence collection about comings and goings of ships visiting Chinese-owned ports. Isn't a lot of information about port visits already available? Public information via websites like marinetraffic.com. Seems like this is already being extensively tracked by commercial interests. And I'll go on. Nader Habibi, who is presenting in this series in 2 weeks on the Levant. But here's a question for you, Isaac. Please comment on the military value of Gwadar, Pakistan for China. Does it have special strategic significance because of Pakistan's CPEC highway and railway corridor between Western China and Gwadar? These land routes can be used for transfer of military assets. Is there any evidence that China is developing military and naval capacities in Gwadar with Pakistani approval? I know you've written on this, so you'll have plenty to say about that, but you can refer him to your work on that. Judith Katz asks, are there implications for the recent US, British, Australia submarine pact on China-owned ports in some countries? What might those ports be? And Martin Chan asks, how influential is the global network of ports on China-US trade disputes and on Western countries' stance assertiveness regarding Hong Kong's political situation? So that's a wide range of questions, but maybe Wendy could take the first one and Isaac the second one. And we'll come back to Judy and Martin's questions at the end. And we'll wrap it up at that point. Okay.
Sure. So thank you very much, Professor Browdigam, for your question. We definitely agree with you that a lot of this information is already available in the commercial realm, and there are Chinese companies that, as well as American firms, that are operating in this space and developing a lot of sophisticated data about the movements of ships and cargoes. So we see companies like Panjiva, for example, in the US, that is the Bloomberg of shipping data. And so highly sophisticated firms that have emerged in just the past recent years to really be able to collect and analyze those publicly available information at scale and integrate it into UIs that are easy for commercial clients to access. So we want to emphasize that this intelligence collection, some of that obviously is already available in public sources, and we are limited to the extent in which we're able to speak with confidence about the other types of information that are potentially being collected about other movements, commercial and otherwise, that are happening with these ports. But we want to make clear that, in addition to the intelligence, I want to overemphasize the intelligence collection, for the reasons that you emphasize, but it's also about developing these operational routines. It's about, we didn't speak a whole lot about upgrading, but it's not like the ports all start out with a certain set of facilities and then they just stay static that way. We see the acquisition, operation, or ownership of some of these terminals by Chinese firms, and then we see a slow and steady upgrading of their facilities that would make them more conducive to supporting technical stops or other types of potential military purpose. So when we've talked about this before, we haven't presented this work often, but we've often gotten pushback, saying, well, this wartime case scenario of wartime use is actually not very probable for all these different reasons. And so in our argument, we've tried to get more sophisticated and more detailed about how even during peacetime, things like the intelligence collection, developing operational routines, supporting the movements of the ships, these are also military uses that are already occurring even in peacetime. So we take your point, and we would just say that that is part of, we think, one piece in a broader puzzle and a broader array of activities that are being conducted at these ports that are not purely commercial in nature. Thank you for your question.
Okay, Isaac, for the Gwadar question.
Sure. Well, I definitely would refer you to our case study. Some colleagues and I at the China Maritime Studies Institute wrote I think it's 23,000 word case study with everything you want to know and don't want to know about Gwadar, including some analysis of the question you're asking here. But just a short answer, and for those not familiar, Gwadar is a port in Pakistan and Balochistan, so very close to the Strait of Hormuz, nearby the Persian Gulf, and China and Pakistan have quite a close military and security relationship. The land corridor is a pipe dream, I guess is one way to think about it. Both the security as well as the geological situation in Pakistan makes it really unlikely that certainly this idea of a corridor coming from the Indian Ocean up to Xinjiang will be realized in our lifetimes. It seems highly unlikely for a whole host of reasons that we can go into. There are convoys that occasionally go up with trucks, and similarly up to Afghanistan, which I think is another interesting to mention. of this. But again, the scale of it and the capacity to actually make it a modern logistics system, I think are pretty daunting challenges for engineering and political and security reasons. The naval capacity of the port of Guadar is an interesting question, and that's sort of separate, if related to the question of inland logistics and transport. Since the Chinese have more fully developed that port, the Pakistan Navy has started to use it fairly regularly, using frigates that the PLA provided for them and has built for them, and presumably has ongoing technical support for. So in a sense, I think it's more likely to become a Pakistani naval base than a Chinese naval base, but there are contingencies under which, and I think particularly those involving India, in which Pakistan certainly would arguably want the PLA to use it. And it's a question there of, does China think it's worth the candle of, I would argue, fundamentally changing its relationship with India, or really turning it to open hostilities, which maybe it has crossed that threshold already after the events in the Himalayas. But the geopolitical costs for China of overtly militarizing that facility and starting to use it, I think, are quite high. And I think it would happen only in the event that Beijing judged that India was no longer unaligned or non-aligned, and that it was necessarily going to be, a de facto American ally. And only then would it make sense to really to change the strategic picture in the region. And I think that, that's a very specific case that has its own dynamics, but I think that's a more general phenomenon, which is that the overt militarization of these facilities is something that is likely quite costly for China. You could think about it in terms of an opportunity cost as well, that it crowds out the opportunity to pursue commercial development, not just in that country, but around the world, because it starts to send the message that China's commercial presence is just it's a slippery slope to a militarized facility. And I don't think that's the impression they want to leave. So plenty more to say on that. I encourage you to read the study that we have on our website. And Grant, I know we're over time. If you want me to take a quick stab at the others, I will, but otherwise we could do it offline.
Well, I think I will just ask you to stick with us if you can for another couple of
Sure.
minutes.
No problem.
Maybe you could comment on the AUKUS question on the Australia, UK, and
yeah,
pact with the US and the subs, and how that affects ports. And then Wendy, this question of Martin Chan's on the how global network of ports relate to US-China trade or to Western assertiveness regarding Taiwan. And then we'll wrap it up after that.
Sure. So on AUKUS, there are a handful of Chinese owned and operated ports in Australia right now. The most notable, or the most sort of well-known at least, is at Darwin, where it's actually a private Chinese firm that signed a very controversial in terms of Australian politics lease to operate that facility. And that facility happens to be where the U.S. deploys 2,500 Marines that the Navy, U.S. Navy 7th Fleet often calls. And one of the implications of the AUKUS arrangement, beyond the submarine pact, is presumably an increase in the presence of the U.S. and UK navies in Australia, which are looking at the Indo-Pacific, obviously, as their premier theater. And and I guess this also speaks to the intelligence collection question from Professor Grout again. It does introduce an additional set of considerations for operational planners who think about where they want to go and where they're going to, say, overhaul a ship or load sensitive supplies, munitions, personnel, etc. And I expect that some part of this deal may include some more detailed discussions with the Australian government about what is going on at that Chinese facility at Darwin. There are a handful of other Chinese-owned operated facilities, one at Newcastle, which is the major coal export port, another hot button issue today in China. and also down in Sydney at Port Botany. So, I think that in a country like Australia, back to that original point, where there's a great deal of scrutiny, specifically on China, but also just in general on sort of jurisdictional issues of who does what at what port, I think there are less concerns about the kind of the misappropriation or the militarization of their assets. That's not sort of thing that you picture happening in Australia. It seems to apply more to a place like Pakistan or Sri Lanka or the Maldives, where the host government may be susceptible to some of to Chinese coercion in a different way, or to Chinese leverage. But I guess just a last point before turning over to Wendy on intelligence collection, and it is correct that marine traffic and other sites will tell you about the comings and goings of ships, but being on site and actually handling cargo is a whole nother world of big data applications. And in fact, China, fit this into the bigger discussion about standard setting. Just recently, a Chinese state logistics information platform just got accepted as part of the international shipping standards. It's called, the English name for it is Logink, Logink, and I will have to pull up the site to remember the long Chinese title for it. But essentially, there are huge volumes of very important commercial data that flow through port operators, and these have to do with much more granular information than you can get from any industry sources. And the companies tend to jealously guard it. A company like Costco sort of has its own, particularly because it owns and operates lots of shipping lines and container ships and cargo ships. This is extremely valuable commercial data, and you can learn a lot about what's going on by physically being at the terminal and loading and unloading and all of that. And I guess just to tack another point on to that intelligence question for those interested, the more operational control you have over your facility, the easier it is to, in place a sensor that is gathering electronic signals or other types of collection tools. And again, you can't really say anything about that with confidence from open sources, other than to say that it just seems like something that you would do if you were interested in military intelligence from these facilities. And we know with high confidence that PLA Navy analysts are interested in it. They write about it. So over and out.
Okay, Wendy.
All right, well, thank you very much for these questions. I mean, we do certainly agree that China's global port expansion is a significant source of anxiety for the US. And one of the reasons is a point that we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which is China has a significant ownership and control through its firms in the global port network that's simply not matched by the United States. So, very different starting positions when it comes to thinking about the commercial stakes in these port terminals around the world. And I think your question is really timely, because the pandemic and all of the supply chain disruptions that has caused for bilateral trade with the US and China really have the US looking more closely at China's role, at vulnerabilities in supply chains in the US, and at China's presence in the global maritime sphere. So, I think we would say that disruption is unlikely by China, but short of disruption, there certainly could be a lot of targeted degradation, or maybe not complete disruption that could be a source of important vulnerability for the US. So, certainly the US is closely aware of this. Who knows, maybe they have a much better data set, Isaac could say, the Navy, about the China's global portfolio than we do. They're very aware of this, they're following it. And I think it's likely, even though we haven't been able to get very much into this, because we haven't been able to do the type of in-depth field work in host countries that it really require, but it's also quite likely that as this global port network expands into particular regions and countries, that there are more conversations that are occurring between the US and host countries, raising some of these issues as it becomes an increasing security concern for the US. And finally, we'd say that it's because of this situation, with the US, that China is forced into this strategy, because the risk of international pushback, if China were to go that traditional approach followed by the US, France, Canada, and others of having extensive overseas bases, it would incur such significant international pushback. It's just not a viable strategy for them. So, for better or worse, this is the approach that they're kind of forced into following by that situation, despite the limitations that it has. Thank you.
Okay, I'll wrap up with some final comments and thank yous. I recommend that you read articles by Dr. Leutert on state-owned enterprises in contemporary China and by Dr. Kardon on peer competitor testimony on China's global ports. That's peer with an IE, one of those puns that they referred to earlier. It's not an EE. And this continues the wordplay that began last session with our look at China's dam diplomacy. Also, watch for our speakers' forthcoming important co-authored article, China's Power Position in Global Ports, for which we've had quite the preview today, which will address the topic. In wrapping up, let me say thank you to all of you who joined for this virtual event. Many of you have stayed well beyond time, so there has been interest in these questions and discussions, and thank you to the speakers for answering them in a full way. And special thanks to both Wendy Leutert and Isaac Kardon for sharing their acute observations. Our appreciation go to the BU Global Development Policy Center and to the Center for the Study of Asia for co-sponsoring this event, and to Xinyu Ma for recording the talk. The recording of this event will be posted on the website of the Pardee School of Global Studies on the webpage with the series label, Assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'm Grant Rode from the Pardee School at BU. Glad that you have joined us for this Maritime Silk Road discussion. Much appreciation to all of you attending, and thank you all very much.